Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to episode 5 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat of mxdwn.com. Thank you for joining us again on this new show that we're populating out on YouTube and Twitch. As a programming note, this is going to be the last show for a couple of weeks. The next couple of weeks, I'm going to be traveling across the country to see family and handle some family business. But then in third week from there, we'll be back to our regular weekly schedule here with this show. Thank you again for joining us. Let's start right away with headlines this week. We've got headlines including news about Trevor Noah, MetaConnect, Bill Murray, Blink-182, and Animal Collective. First off, Trevor Noah, long-running host of The Daily Show, formerly hosted by Jon Stewart until 2015, has announced that he is exiting and resigning his post as host of the show on Comedy Central. He's also announced the final day of the program that he will be hosting, which will be Thursday, December 8th. Trevor Noah has been hosting since 2015. Secondly, in the world of games, MetaConnect, literally the Oculus VR capacity gaming console owned by Meta, now the new rebranded name of Facebook, has announced several premier titles for their VR headset, which is Among Us VR, the VR version of the popular mobile collaborative game, and Iron Man VR from Marvel, respectively releasing November 3rd and November 10th. In other sadder, weirder news, Puck News is reporting they are alleging that Bill Murray, on the set of the film Being Mortal, had an inappropriate behavior incident. No one really has the exact clear details of what happened or what was involved, but they are alleging that after said incident, there was mediation and that he allegedly paid the person that he acted inappropriately with $100,000 to make everything be okay and go away. Now, when everything happened, the production run by Searchlight Pictures, it was being directed as the debut directorial film for Aziz Ansari, the comedian and former Master of None star on Netflix, was shelved. The whole movie was put on ice when everything happened. And according to Puck News and their sources, which has not been confirmed by other sources at this point, there is an effort by Aziz Ansari and Bill Murray and other cast members and production crew to try to bring the movie back to life, but Searchlight Pictures is allegedly not interested in it. We'll have more for you when there's more information. In the world of music, Tom DeLonge has announced that he's rejoining Mark Hoppus and Travis Barker in Blink-182, the band the three of them made famous over the last 20 years. They will be engaging on a worldwide tour and, of course, in typical Blink-182 fashion, had a tongue-in-cheek video of various people all over the world being excited that the band was coming. I'll leave that right there. Now, Tom DeLonge returns to the band after having vacated it for the second time in 2015, and he was replaced up until this point by Matt Skiba of the band Alkaline Trio. He'll be returning to the band that he made famous, and with their classic albums, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. Lastly, and this will feed into this week's story, Animal Collective, the experimental indie alternative band, has announced that their entire UK and EU tours have been canceled. Now, the band was scheduled to engage in a several months long trek through the UK and the European Union starting next month. But the band put out a large announcement out on their Instagram channel indicating a myriad of reasons that they had to pull the plug on the tour. Not the least of which is that living and trying to tour in the midst of this global COVID-19 pandemic has had its own health challenges over the course of presumably the last couple of years. 3 out of the 4 members of the band ended up with COVID at one point or another. But as they were framing up and getting ready to engage in this tour, they had to pull the plug on everything. And they indicated in their reasoning as to why, quote, "But preparing for this tour, we are looking at an economic reality that simply does not work and is not sustainable. From inflation to currency devaluation to bloated shipping and transportation costs, and much more, we simply could not make a budget for this tour that did not lose money, even if everything went as well as it could." Now, this feeds directly into our story for this week, which I'm calling Inherent Contradiction. Now, Animal Collective, having been around some 20 years and 10 albums worth of material in their own time, was a supremely successful band. In the early 2000s was what we think of as like the indie rock explosion, and ultimately a bevy of bands in the indie genre started to become big in the wake of the success of the Strokes and the White Stripes. And Animal Collective, massively successful in this time, as probably the most, along with, say, the Unicorns, the most outwardly experimental of the bands in that time frame. Found massive success over the years. I wouldn't say, for me personally, I was a big fan of what they did, but I always had a deep and abiding appreciation of their work in terms of the fact that it was outwardly experimental and that they were deliberately, consciously trying to do very eclectic things. They made a name for themselves behind it. And it might not have been my variety of experimental music, but I always had a deep appreciation for the fact that they were out there trying that. They were out there doing that. I suppose you could think of it as their pinnacle. All the way back in 2011, they were the second headliner at Coachella 2011, right underneath Arcade Fire, playing on the main stage. Now, that's not easy. Not every band can make it to that point. Not every band can get to the point where they can even play the main stage at Coachella, much less be the second to last band playing on Saturday night. It's a huge accomplishment, and it says something about their stature, their quality, their connection with their fans, their popularity. Now, this world is going through its own measure of incredible upheaval right now. Everything has been shaken loose, broken, torn apart, or made unable to function in the ways that we were used to because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody knows this isn't breaking news. But to that end, this exposes some things that I think are a part of an inherent contradiction in the way Western culture absorbs and enjoys music. Now, if you're a giant country music fan, if you listen to modern country music, there is a paradigm in country music that is very different from most other genres of music. You could say to some extent, maybe in hip hop, but typically country music fans don't have hangups about their bands that they love, the artists that they love, being able to be massively successful. Ultimately, these bands and these artists, even though they are exceptional everymen, even though that they are in their own way, still very much looked at as just the guy down the road, the guy who's just like everybody else. They're multimillionaires, and their fans don't necessarily look down on them for it. Whereas there is this bizarre kind of inherent contradiction in the world of rock and roll or most modern genres of music that artists somehow need to not be capitalists. Artists need somehow to be cravenly artistic and penniless and broke. I mean, there's certainly things that one could debate about, and there's more egregious partnerships and using one's music or art in terms of benefiting things that are mass market companies that maybe don't have the consumer's best interests at heart. But at the end of the day, every person behind a band, every artist is a human just like the rest of us. They have to pay bills. They have to be able to feed themselves. They have to be able to think about their future. Nothing is promised to anyone forever. Just because you're successful for a few years in music doesn't mean 30 years from now you'll be able to make the same amount of money. What if you need to retire? What retirement package or pension is there if you are a performing artist or a recording artist? What world is there that looks out for you in terms of what might come and what's coming down the line? Now, it is a part of Western culture in terms of that belief that, especially people in younger years, teenagers, you might hear people talk about music they like, and they're like, oh, I really liked them until they sold out. They were a great band until they completely sold out. But at the same time, how many bands out there aren't technically a business? Now, this was described quite well in the Tool song, Hooker with a Penis, where Maynard James Keenan, whether fictionally or not, recounted a conversation with a fan who was basically lambasting Tool as having, gone jumping the shark and had completely sold out and that they weren't pure anymore. And him expressing his rage at how much it took to be able to have a band and to be able to express his art with regularity. There's something weird about the way that in the Western world, we look at most conventional and modern genres of music, that there's this inherent expectation that somehow the people doing this are super, super, super pure artists. They're always there. They're always available. Their music's always available. They're always on the road, but somehow they don't have to make a living. Now, right now, we're operating, at least here in the United States, and of course, reportedly also in Europe to some extent too, in a world of Very boring, I know, subject matter for an entertainment magazine, but massive inflation. The cost of everything is going up: groceries, gas, the ability to ship things. As a result of that inflation, our money is worth less and less. What we used to be able to make to be able to sustain ourselves, pay the rent, and live is no longer sufficient to be able to get by. And this is affecting absolutely everything, everyone and everything everywhere. But think about it. If a band like Animal Collective is going to go on tour, now admittedly a European tour is a little bit more complicated than, say, just getting in a van and rolling across the United States. But think of how many things have to happen correctly in order for that to happen. Okay? There has to be management thinking of and dressing a tour. There has to be a booking agent planning for how this tour could be presented to potential promoters. Here's what we expect to draw in your local market. Then there's a long series of negotiations working between the promoters and the booking agent to figure out if they can have a deal to have Animal Collective play X show with Y amount of tickets to be sold. Then if all that goes well, everything has to be packaged and planned and prepped. Marketing and advertising in dozens of different local markets have to be prepared. And then publicity is engaged to basically put the news and the information about the tour out to the world in a hopes that people will buy tickets. Usually, when it comes to the American concert industry, typically about 90 days for the average tour that's going to hit the road. And if it's a bigger tour, if you're talking about, I don't know, Celine Dion playing stadiums or something, maybe as much as a year in advance. But typically, there's about 90 days from the point of announcement where the tour is presented, and then ultimately the shows start happening to give them as much time as possible to try to sell out the shows. Then, as they're getting ready for that, they have to book travel accommodations. Whether they need a van, do they have to have merch made? Do they have to have people and personnel on the tour, depending on the band? Maybe they need security. And all of that, especially if you're going abroad, requires personnel, time, visas. I mean, in today's day and age, every year a little bit harder and a little bit more difficult, having the kind of support in order to be able to get on the road and leave the country is ever more difficult. And of course, it goes the same for many great European bands coming here to America. Many bands that ultimately have a footprint here and have a fan base here plan for a year trying to go through the proper departments to get everything approved to try to basically be able to get on the road and come here to America. And 2 weeks before they get on the plane, they're told by the State Department that, no, your application is denied. You're not allowed to come into America. So think about all of those things that need to happen in order to make this work. And then imagine Animal Collective, not just some random band, a band that in 2011, second headliner on the main stage on Saturday of Coachella 2011, indicates from inflation to currency devaluation to bloated shipping and transportation costs. That means getting there. That means things that they need to ship there, whether that's merchandise or whether that's guitars and amps. That means everything's getting more expensive. Now, it's all cute and it's all well and good when people have some kind of Mick Jagger, Julian Casablancas image of artists being these like bohemian New York socialites that never really need to like make a living and pay their bills and do normal things that all humans do. But at the end of the day, every single one of these artists does, unless you're a monster of the industry, an Adele, a Taylor Swift, a Beyonce, unless you're living with tens of millions of dollars to be able to do something. If you're The Weeknd, you're probably fine. But for most everybody else, they got to work for a living, just like the rest of us do. And at the end of the day, they're expected to act as if this is not a necessary and fundamental part of their business, and that somehow they're supposed to be kind of too cool for that and to be able to make it work. But think about it. Even someone as big as Animal Collective in this environment, with things as they are, it's posing to be too difficult. We're not talking about somebody who's gone through sexual misconduct allegations and is in danger of being, canceled by the world or culture at large. Just a band that people like, a band that's been around for 20 years and done lots of music that people love. And at the end of the day, even they can't make it work. Now imagine if you're quite a bit further down the line. Imagine if you're not Animal Collective and you're just, that band. Some band that people like or had a moment where they were popular. And imagine trying to go and do those things. In terms of history in America, there was the get in the van era of the early 80s punk movement. And there's this whole notion that, if you were Black Flag, for example, a bunch of guys could jump in a van with a set of drums and a couple amps and guitars and just go around the country playing gigs wherever you could, sleeping on people's couches. And, it was possible. You could do it DIY on the cheap. But imagine wherever you are watching this video, if you're anywhere in America, or worse yet, in the European Union, what is the price of gas where you live? Does it feel like it's exorbitantly more than it was just 2 years ago? How hard is that going to be just from a measure of transportation? It's not like everyone exists in this almost famous reality where everyone has like a Led Zeppelin style private jet that they can fly around. Everyone else has got to drive or maybe occasionally fly to specific gigs. And if we're at the point where right now, even a band as large as Animal Collective is struggling under the realities that are no fault of their own, that are ultimately something that has been blooming and growing and a problem going back several presidents and has to do with the arc of the entire economy. And then, of course, what it took to keep the economy afloat when basically no one could leave their house for the better part of a year. And imagine if you're a below the line band, what kind of a dilemma you might be in right now. The expectation of fans in the Western world is one that artists aren't supposed to be a business. Be out there, be pure, be great. But, don't be trying to make a living at all costs. That's a no-no. You're this paragon that we expect you to be of complete, unimpeachable class. But imagine now the realities that we're all facing in. I've been saying personally, privately, amidst friends in the music business or amidst people that write for Mixdown, for about 5-6 years now, I thought that concert festivals were far too expensive. In general, it used to be that if you even go into Coachella with Radiohead happening, $100 per day, very reasonable considering you could see 15 bands in the scope of a day. But the prices on everything, even if you're talking about a local club show, have gone way up because that problem, that ultimately everything costs more. And if you're a concert venue and not an open field like Coachella, you're talking about manpower, electricity, rent, taxes, insurance. Hell, I mean, the rumor around a lot of Southern California shows is that young punk bands, there's nowhere to play because everybody's too afraid of what will happen if somebody gets injured and somebody sues. So ask yourself, in this climate where prices have been going up and up and up and up and up, and not here today to expand on the economics of the concert industry or the festival industry, because that's its own very complicated animal. But imagine if it was already getting immensely expensive before we had screaming inflation. How long is it going to be before we start hearing about not that many tours, not that many bands able to go on the road, or a lot of bands hitting the road that ultimately find that it's not working, it's not making sense, and then have to bail out? I'm not here to advocate for pure capitalism in some intense sense, like, no, we'll go and sell everything to Coca-Cola and be, I don't know, the brand sponsor for Meta and Facebook and support evil companies that pollute things. I'm not trying to make that argument, but I do think the idolatry of this universe and everything that is being a fan of music causes people to have a little bit of a delusional connection with what it takes for this to exist and the people behind it. It might be, just to make the smallest of suggestions, the time to think about, in terms of the world in front of us, if there's anything you can do for these artists that aren't a part of some giant conglomeration of major multimedia companies that can help them survive a little better. Now might be the time to think about it, because if Animal Collective can't make it through a UK EU tour because it's just too expensive and it's going to be too hard to stage it in any way that makes sense, it's about to get really difficult for most other bands. That's all for This Week is Live. Thank you again for joining us. So glad to see you well. And as I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, we'll be off for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll be returning after that in early November. Thanks so much.